sort of touched a little bit there about the challenge sort of locally of, you know, trying to get enough officers, trying to organise people, trying to get people involved. It's can be a real challenge. One of the results is that people's voices, certain voices can be missing from the table, and certain perspectives can be missing. So TJ, I know that you've sort of done that move from activist to staff member. So it'd be good to hear from you in terms of your perspective of what are some of the ways that that move happens for people or doesn't happen, that means that some voices aren't there or we're not hearing them.
Thanks. I read somewhere recently an interesting quote: if you don't have a seat at the table, then you're probably on the menu. Yeah, and I think that's quite relevant in this discussion. As someone living and working in the Southwest, I think the perspective is very different to somewhere like London. Visibly, the Southwest looks a lot less diverse, and statistically it is. I did some research recently for the regional, for the region, and less than 5% of our members in the Southwest are not from white backgrounds. Sometimes you'll have a branch secretary, he'll say, oh, I don't have any black members in my branch. And actually, sometimes they're right, if some small branches don't. But the research I did was very interesting, seeing whether which branches or sectors tend to have a greater diversity, and it's usually health branches. It's certainly in the Southwest. Go back to your question, Addie. So I was a UNISON member. I used to work for the local council, and as a UNISON activist. I was on the national LGBT SOG committee. Well, originally it was the Lesbian Gay Committee, and I was a member as we went through that transition. And then I got the job in the regional office, and it was difficult going from being a senior activist to being a junior member of staff, and there really wasn't the support available, I think, for that particular transition.
So it was quite a strange feeling move for you, I suppose. So I guess what's interesting for me there is that, are there ways that people maybe tend to end up in union roles, maybe taking the route you did or taking other routes, that might mean that certain voices or certain groups just are less likely to make it through or find it harder to navigate? And what are the implications of that for the wider sort of range of voices across the union, in terms of, you know, like you say, who's at the table and who isn't? I love that quote so much. I'm gonna borrow that. It's so good. Along with race, trans rights have been in the headlines in the last few years, with really increasing hostility towards the trans community in the press. Quite a common approach to this subject is to try and set up women's rights and trans rights as in opposition to one another. Carol, I'm going to come to you first. Can you speak a bit about this and the impact that it has on you?
Whenever there's a conversation about rights being in conflict with each other, it sets off alarm bells for me, and I have a suspicious look at what's been said. I think where we start getting into a competition either of who's the biggest victim or whose rights are the most important, we're really heading down the wrong road. And as you said when you posed the question, we're seeing a lot of this, as if trans rights and women's rights are in conflict with each other. As a cis woman, I have never felt that trans rights impact on my rights as a woman, and I'm in very good company there, from our general secretary across the union. There are many cis women who, like me, are very clear that trans rights and women's rights, setting them against each other, is just so unhelpful, so unnecessary, and doesn't progress equality for anyone. And what I know from my time working on trans rights in UNISON, and from just being a human being, is that trans workers are the most discriminated against and excluded group of workers. Trans people face the most at risk of violence on the streets, the most vulnerable to attacks in social media. And there is no problem for us working for trans rights and working for women's rights side by side and together. And one of the things that gives me much joy is the elected chair of the UNISON's Women's Committee for the last 2 years is an out proud trans woman.
Thanks, Carola. That's wonderful. TJ, I'm going to hand over to you now for your perspective on this. I know it's not the most delightful subject to talk about, but an important one.
Thanks, Addie. So I realized I was trans about 5 or 6 years ago, and I've been going through a kind of slow social transition at work since then. And it's been a bit of a mixed bag. You know, colleagues have been pretty good about using my new name, but they still get it wrong when they use pronouns. One of the first things I did was change my name and my email signature and added pronouns. So I didn't come out with a fanfare. It was more of like, if people read to the bottom of the email, then they noticed something different. Working for UNISON, I know that UNISON puts out a lot of really good, supportive, progressive information and like suggested policies for people to push forward in their workplaces. But within UNISON, we're sometimes a lot slower at implementing those things. So when I started to change my name, I looked up on our internal policies and was surprised to see we didn't actually have a trans policy for staff. And so I brought a motion to my staff trade union AGM, and from that we developed a joint policy between the unions. But that was 2018, and we're still waiting for it to work its way through the internal systems. So things like changing your name is straightforward in one way, but when I walk into the office, you see a male toilet and a female toilet, and people say, oh, it's all about pronouns and toilets, but sometimes actually those are really important things. And if you don't see something that fits you, you wonder where you fit at all, really. But UNISON itself has had self-ID. It's a buzzword for the so-called fight between women and trans people. But self-ID for UNISON members has existed for years and years in terms of registering for conference in the gender that is correct for you, not necessarily the one that's on the system. So yeah, it's a struggle, but yeah, that's it. It is what it is, I guess.
If you think about it in terms of another group, so baby changing facilities, right? If baby changing facilities aren't easily available in public spaces, it means that parents, let alone if it's a dad on his own, because for a while it was, often the baby change was just in the women's toilets and so on. Increasingly now they're a separate space. But if that very basic facility isn't there, it means that a group of people are restricted in the movement they can make in public and where they can go. So while toilets might seem like either one of those things that always comes up or a sort of, strangely practical thing to be thinking about, if you can't go to the loo kind of safely and, wherever you go, you can't go there because it's part of being human. So it's actually a big restriction on where you can go and how comfortable you can be there. So it can be quite an important thing to think about in terms of provision of facilities, just at a very basic human level, is actually if we're using a space, a building, a conference center, whatever it is can the people who want to be there actually access it, just from a really, really basic level in terms of can they use the loo? It's a, you know, it's a big question.
In a new building or a development of a building, it's completely inexcusable not to provide ungendered facilities. But you know, UNISON uses a whole host of other buildings of various ages and states, and it's often quite simple just to put up a bit of signage on top and redesignate some facilities for everyone. So I think that the age of the building doesn't have to be to prevent some progress on this.
Yeah,
And I
absolutely.
think behind this and behind the conflict, the other point about what's behind the conflict, the supposed conflict, is the simple fact that what people are saying who are opposed to trans rights and see this conflict is they just don't believe trans women are women. And in UNISON, we are absolutely clear: trans women are women, trans men are men, and non-binary people are non-binary.
Thanks, Carola. So before we move on to the next question, any sort of closing thoughts on this one, TJ?
Yeah, just to, you know, I think I was probably the first out trans and non-binary member of UNISON staff, but I don't think I'll be the last one.
I mean, I hope not. I'm sure you won't be. I find that in a lot of organisations, one person opens the door and then you start noticing other people walking through it, which is, yeah, wonderful, which is probably entirely likely what you've done, TJ.